At sunset on April 5, 1945, Hong Kong's harbor bustled with frantic activity as Convoy HO-MO-03 prepared to depart. 2 transport ships, laden with precious supplies for Japan's war-ravaged homeland, were flanked by 2 Kaibōkan escorts and a pair of nimble submarine chasers. With a makeshift bow hastily rebuilt after a close call, the ship looked like nothing else in the Imperial Japanese Navy's arsenal. Though scarred and slower than before, beneath that patchwork exterior, Amatsukaze still carried the firepower needed to defend the convoy, just as she had done time and again in the face of destruction. Allied intelligence was ever watchful as the convoy slipped out of the harbor, and the waters ahead were teeming with submarines and aircraft waiting to strike. Aboard Amatsukaze, everyone in the crew knew this was a dangerous mission, but this ship had defied fate before, and they were prepared to do it again. In March 1942, with the Pacific War in full swing, the Battle of the Java Sea was at its height as Japanese forces pressed their advantage across Southeast Asia. Amid this fierce struggle, the Imperial Japanese Navy scoured the waters for enemy ships. Amatsukaze, a nimble Kagero-class destroyer, roamed the Java Sea. Her captain, Lieutenant Commander Tameichi Hara, was ordered to search the area for Allied ships, particularly submarines. On the night of March 3rd, around 8:30 p.m., Captain Hara spotted a dim, flickering yellow light several thousand meters away on Amatsukaze's starboard bow. It blinked once and quickly disappeared, like the flick of a match. Curious, the captain pulled out his pocket binoculars and gazed in the same direction. At that moment, he realized that, quote, "Yes, someone was on deck smoking a cigarette. I estimated the distance as 4,000 meters, almost due north and forward of Amatsukaze's course." The destroyers surged ahead through the darkness, all hands at battle stations. The target, a surface submarine moving eastward, was confirmed by a searchlight highlighting her silhouette. Amatsukaze accelerated to 26 knots, swinging left to close in at 2,300 meters, ready to attack. Within seconds of the order, the first salvo roared violently but missed. Suddenly, 2 foaming lines streaked toward Amatsukaze. Aboard, one of the sailors shouted, quote, "Torpedoes." Hara and the crew's hearts pounded as Amatsukaze twisted sharply, narrowly avoiding the torpedoes. Back at the destroyer, the second salvo struck the sub with a fiery explosion that lit up the night. Flames engulfed the conning tower before the submarine vanished beneath the waves. Not taking any chances, Amatsukaze released a total of 6 depth charges at the site. And while the sea billowed and churned violently, it then fell silent. Nothing remained of the enemy but the fading ripples in the dark water. According to him, quote, "We cleared out at 23:45 after combing the area for possible sonar contacts." There were no signs that the sub was alive. After the weather cleared the following day, the destroyer and her men returned to the battle scene and found a thick trail of oil marking the submarine's final resting place. Captain Hara gathered the crew to acknowledge their teamwork and remind them of the challenges still ahead. However, he also took the time to attribute the submarine's loss to, quote, "the unpardonable stupidity of one man who smoked on the surface deck." Identifying the submarine that Amatsukaze sank remains a mystery. Although it's known that Amatsukaze damaged USS Perch on March 1st, the details of Perch's final days don't match Captain Hara's account. Some believe the target may have been a Dutch submarine, but no definitive record has surfaced. Amatsukaze was soon destined for a much more brutal encounter. The First Naval Battle of Guadalcanal was one of the biggest naval engagements of the entire Pacific War. A chaotic clash of capital ships and destroyers in the dark, where both sides fought at close range with devastating results. As part of Rear Admiral Hiroaki Abe's force, Amatsukaze joined the battleships Hiei and Kirishima, light cruiser Nagara, and 13 other destroyers. The fleet pressed south, entering the treacherous waters of Iron Bottom Sound. The Americans had brought 2 heavy cruisers, 8 destroyers, and 3 light cruisers, and were closing in fast. Under the cover of darkness, the 2 sides closed to a mere 2,700 meters, quickly exploding into a chaotic brawl, the ships firing at point-blank range. Amatsukaze and Udachi moved independently to engage the trailing American vessels, with the former launching 2 torpedoes that struck USS Barton, breaking her in half and sending her down in minutes. Turning her sights back north, Amatsukaze targeted USS Juno, hitting her amidships and forcing her to withdraw. Returning on only one propeller, Juno was finished off later that morning by the submarine I-26. Not ready to give up just yet, Amatsukaze then set her sights on the heavily damaged USS San Francisco. But before she could strike, USS Helena spotted her lights. Shells tore into Amatsukaze, hitting her aft boiler and knocking out her rudder. 45 crewmen perished, and her guns were silenced. While the ship was listing, she escaped under the cover of smoke, aided by 3 supporting destroyers. After the battle, Captain Tamaichi Hara was promoted and reassigned to another ship, while Amatsukaze returned to Japan for repairs, where she received a radar detection device, upgraded 25mm triple anti-aircraft mounts, and an additional twin 25mm mount forward of the bridge. Revamped, and with newly appointed Captain Furukawa Bunji, she was ready for the next battle. On January 11th, 1944, the waters of the South China Sea were deceivingly calm as Amatsukaze and her convoy of high-speed oil tankers made their way toward Singapore. That day, the destroyer's mission was to ensure that vital fuel supplies reached their destination to keep Japan's war machine running. Lurking in the depths, American submarine USS Redfin silently tracked her every move, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Amatsukaze's sharp-eyed lookouts spotted the submarine's periscope slicing through the surface, prompting her to turn and close in. But just as quickly, the American sub vanished into the depths. Captain Bunji decided to turn away and rejoin the convoy, believing the danger had passed. But Redfin hadn't gone anywhere. From below, the submarine's crew watched as Amatsukaze turned, exposing her broadside. Captain John B. Parham gave the order, and 4 torpedoes shot from Redfin's tubes. Moments later, the first struck Amatsukaze with a blinding flash. The detonation tore through her compartments, followed by a second massive explosion that sent a fiery plume into the sky. In an instant, the ship was torn in half, with the destroyer's bow vanishing in a spray of metal and water, pulling men and debris into the sea, including Captain Furukawa and 79 other crew members. But against all odds, the aft section stayed afloat. Drenched and injured, second-in-command Captain Tanaka and the surviving crew clambered onto the mangled remains, barely holding on as the ocean tossed them around, while the rest of the convoy, unaware that part of the ship still floated, pressed on. With the ship's engine flooded and the radio equipment lost, Amatsukaze drifted helplessly for 6 grueling days. Each day, the crew struggled to stay alive, patching up holes with whatever they could find, sharing dwindling rations, and desperately scanning the sky for any sign of help. Then, on January 16th, a Japanese patrol plane finally caught sight of the drifting wreckage. And soon, help arrived, in the form of the aging destroyer Asagao, which gingerly towed Amatsukaze to Singapore. Back in the dry dock, Amatsukaze's transformation began. While the damage was catastrophic, the Japanese engineers patched up her hull and gave her a new temporary bow where the original had been blown away. Next, they turned their attention to her defenses, adding 3 13mm machine guns and 2 25mm cannons on her aft to increase her anti-aircraft capability. For nearly the rest of the year, she remained docked for repairs. When finished, she could now only reach 20 knots, a shadow of her former speed of 35 knots, and Amatsukaze seemed like an easy target. But her makeshift bow created a wave pattern that made her appear much faster than she actually was. This illusion could confuse enemy targeting systems that relied on speed and heading. Misjudging her true speed, enemy ships might fire too far ahead or dismiss her as a lesser threat altogether. These miscalculations would leave Amatsukaze with one more chance to strike back when they least expected it. By the spring of 1945, American forces had already captured Iwo Jima and were now engaged in the brutal battle for Okinawa. The skies all over Japan faced daily bombardment from B-29 superfortresses, while American submarines and aircraft relentlessly hunted down what little remained of the Empire's once great fleet. Below, reduced to a shadow of its former self and desperate for reinforcements, the few remaining Japanese ships were left to run increasingly dangerous supply missions. At sunset on April 5, 1945, dozens of sailors and workers in Hong Kong prepared as destroyer Amatsukaze took her position within Convoy HO-MO-03. Her companions that day were 2 transport ships carrying precious supplies to the war-ravaged Japanese homeland, flanked by 2 Kaibōkan escorts and a pair of nimble submarine chasers. With their holds secured and the crew at their stations, the convoy quietly slipped out of Hong Kong's harbor, ready for their perilous journey through waters now dominated by Allied submarines and aircraft. But the group's departure didn't go unnoticed. Early the next day, Allied intelligence quickly detected the small Japanese flotilla as it hugged the Chinese coast. For the United States 345th Bomber Group, this was another chance to disrupt Japan's lifelines. As the sun climbed higher on April 6th, 24 B-25 strafers from the 345th Bomb Group roared across the sky. At 11:30 a.m., the pilots spotted their first targets, 2 Japanese frigates cutting through the waters below. The first bomb bounced across the surface and detonated on the frigate's deck, immediately followed by another that tore through her hull. A plume of black smoke billowed into the sky as the escort listed sharply and slipped beneath the surface. Before the chaos settled, Lieutenant Lester Morton's aircraft swooped in. His bomb found its mark just before the second frigate's waterline, splitting the vessel's hull wide open. Within moments, she too capsized, her keel briefly exposed before vanishing beneath the waves. With both escorts destroyed in mere minutes, the American pilots, now with adrenaline coursing through them, circled back to strafe the water, tracers sparking against the surface as they targeted Japanese sailors struggling to stay afloat. Amid the confusion, the 500th Squadron, arriving a little too late to the attack, scanned the coastline for any remaining threats. After 10 tense minutes, First Lieutenant George Schmidt spotted Amatsukaze. Confused by the ship's strange shape, the American pilots couldn't quite identify it, but they knew one thing: it wasn't leaving these waters intact. Leading his 6 B-25s, Schmidt ordered a daring low-altitude run, the aircraft's engines howling as they dove toward their target. The Americans had mistaken Amatsukaze for a merchant vessel, fooled by her unusual appearance and heavily damaged profile. But this was no helpless freighter. Beneath the patches and makeshift repairs, Amatsukaze still bristled with firepower. As the formation closed in, her anti-aircraft batteries exploded into action, filling the sky with a storm of tracer fire and bursting shells. The incoming B-25s rocked violently as shells and shrapnel streaked past. Schmidt held his course, gritting his teeth, determined to push through. Flying alongside him, Flying Officer Van Scoik and Lieutenant Joe Herrick unleashed their own salvo, their guns blazing as they tried to suppress the raging torrent of fire below. Amatsukaze's crew fought back, sending round after round up at the attackers. A well-aimed 40mm shell punched through the fuselage of Herrick's B-25, detonating with a thunderous crack. The aircraft jerked, shuddered, and then nosedived violently. Herrick's plane slammed into the sea, breaking apart on impact. The Americans reeled from the loss, but Schmidt pushed on. Lining up his run, he released his bombs. Both found their mark, slamming into Amatsukaze with devastating accuracy. The first hit her forward, and the second tore into her midsection. Yet, even as her hull shuddered and flames licked at her deck, the fierce destroyer held her ground, her guns still spitting fire defiantly at the retreating B-25s. As one squadron limped back to base, another, the 498th, arrived to continue the attack. Amatsukaze was still moving at full speed, a dark plume trailing behind her. Lieutenant James Manners led a flight of 3 B-25s, using the smoke as cover to approach the destroyer unseen, while Captain Albin V. Johnson's flight swung wide, planning to strike from a different angle. Amatsukaze's crew threw everything they had into one last stand. Their anti-aircraft batteries roared back to life, filling the air with a hail of gunfire. The sea around the B-25s erupted with near misses, the shockwaves rattling the bombers. Johnson's plane took a direct hit as he lined up his attack, his B-25 shuddering violently. Still, he held steady and released his bombs, scoring a direct hit on Amatsukaze's stern. But the damage to his aircraft was too severe. As Johnson pulled away, flames engulfed his engine, and his crippled B-25 began to lose altitude. With no choice, he brought the stricken plane down into the choppy waters. Manners' flight, emerging from behind the smoke, pressed the attack, sweeping over the destroyer from stern to bow. Explosions tore across Amatsukaze's deck, scattering debris and sending flames up her battered hull. Low on fuel and wary of further enemy resistance, the 498th pulled away. The American pilots believed they delivered the final blow. Yet, the Japanese crew managed to beach Amatsukaze to prevent her from sinking completely. 2 days later, all attempts to salvage the battered destroyer were abandoned. On April 10, 1945, Amatsukaze was finally scuttled with explosive charges, ending the storied career of a ship that had defied the odds time and time again.